flex my world building muscles a little bit and be like, look at all this cool stuff that exists in the world that I created, like, so you know it's here. Hi, I'm Madeline James, and today I wanted to review, have a world building analysis, and chat about Hannah Whitten's debut fantasy novel, For the Wolf. This is the first book in the Wilderwood fantasy series that she started, and it is the only one that's out right now. But I read this book back when it came out in June, and it is a really fun, creepy, dark, atmospheric adult fantasy novel. There are two alternating POVs in this, the main one being Red, the second daughter, who we follow being sacrificed to the wolf, taken to the Wilderwood, and the second POV being her older sister, the first daughter, Neve. The world building for this is definitely going for something dark and fairy tale-esque. I get kind of vibes of Beauty and the Beast, Little Red Riding Hood, the darker versions of those a bit. And this is marketed as adult fantasy, but the world itself has some young adult, new adult vibes for me. And this isn't saying that it's not epic, that it's not complex, that it's not good or detailed. I'm just talking about, like, you could sum up the main idea of the world in a couple sentences pretty easily. The world building really just revolves around the central premise, and it stays pretty tight to that. Which, for an atmospheric fairy tale-esque fantasy, I think that's kind of expected. Let's get reading. My intention here with this world building review is to not spoil anything, so that if you're reading this kind of to get like a feel of the world and you haven't read it yet, then you should be good. I like to think about world building in two phases, right, when you're reading. So you have that first introduction, which is like 4 chapters, which is introductory, setting up everything, laying the groundwork, that kind of world building. And then most of the world building after that is what is going to be your twists, reveals, spoilers, things that are going to be a bit more significant, right? So they might be involved in mysteries or plot twists or like completely changing the direction of the character's goals, that sort of thing. So we're not going to touch on that part. We're just going to focus on the introductory world building. The first daughter is for the throne, the second daughter is for the wolf, and the wolves are for the Wilderwood. And I think it kind of sets up a little bit of this duality, which is a really big theme in this book, both in the way the characters are done and the way the, world building is kind of set up. You have the regular world, which is non-magical, and then you have 2 sort of separate magical realms. One of these is the Wilderwood, and the other one is the Shadowlands, which is sort of touched on a little bit in this book. And then, of course, we have 2 sisters. You have Red and you have Neve. Neve is the first daughter, Red is the second daughter. And even though they kind of grew up, obviously together, they're both princesses, whatever, their lives were incredibly different because Neve is expecting to become queen, right? She's being groomed to rule, whereas Red is being prepared to be sacrificed. She is more like a religious figure than anything else. So they want to sacrifice Red, and they're hoping that she is pure enough, good enough, to convince the wolf to release the kings, is basically what that is. So you can imagine that that sets them up very differently. So in a lot of ways, this kind of keeps everything really tight, right? Because like you have this great world, you have this one of these daughters that's going to become queen one day, and like that could be pretty large scale, right? But her focus being on Red and what's happening to her and the sacrifice she has to go through keeps everything kind of really tight without having to push on the rest of the world that much and bring too much of it in. So you really see in general this story confined to the Wilderwood, and then you get hints of the outside world. And that's mostly what you get here. And that, I think, impacts the sort of atmospheric feel of this fantasy. I'm not sure what a good definition of atmospheric is, but it's like, if I had to describe it, it's like this overarching tone, right? That is layered on to give this kind of same eerie, creepy feeling that kind of just goes through everything. And as we'll talk about more, the Wilderwood is incredibly creepy. Like, it's a living forest that wants to drain Red's blood, basically. Like, it's not all good, it's not all bad, it's this complicated, like, entity that like lives and breathes and thinks and has wants and desires, and it just creates this creepy feeling, like, throughout every single chapter of this entire book, where you can feel the Wilderwood's presence. And that's kind of how I would explain the fact that it's an atmospheric fantasy. I've seen a lot of people in some of the reviews for this be like, what does atmospheric mean? But if they had expanded the world building to really bringing in other places, having more scenes in other places where it wasn't all focused on that same kind of tone, right? That would have broken that atmospheric feeling that I think really works very, very well for this story. I expect that the world is going to maybe get bigger in later books. I'm not really sure, but you get just enough about the world outside of, I guess, Valida, which is the kingdom where Red and Neve are, I guess, princesses of at the beginning of the book. So you obviously have Red, you have Neve, you have their mother, which is Queen Isla, Isla. I'm horrible at pronouncing things, I apologize. You have two side characters from that Valida palace, castle, capital. You have Raph, the son of a Medusan ambassador, and you have Lord Auric, Duke of Florane, consort-elect. And he is engaged to Neve, but he has, I guess, a romance with Red, whereas Raph has a romance with Neve. So that's sort of your starting cast in the first chapter or two. And then you have the Wilderwoods, which that's where the wolf lives. That's the big character there. And then you have those people that are trapped in the Wilderwoods. And then you have the Shadowlands, which is where the Five Kings are trapped. And then the only other big organization is probably the Order of the Five Kings. We're going to see the Order of the Five Kingdoms having a high priestess and different priestesses that kind of come into play a lot with this because, you know, that religious belief is very important to kind of how the plot plays out and why the world is the way it is, right? You know, what causes a people to sacrifice their second daughters to this world, this like deadly forest that just like murders them, that keeps beasts and gods at, you know, imprisoned and then releases beasts on the world if, you know, they're not doing what they're supposed to, that sort of thing. So the Order of the Five Kings is mainly responsible for, I guess, passing on that knowledge of the oaths that have led to this, you know, first daughters for the throne, second daughters for the Wilderwood kind of thing, or for the wolf. They're in charge of that. They're in charge of guarding that so that the wolf does not release beasts on the world to terrorize and murder and kill and all of that. Murder and kill are the same thing. It's fine. And they're in charge of making sure prayer taxes are collected, and they lead the worship of the Five Kings, which we will get into more in a moment because we're going to kind of talk about the history and how a world like this came to be. Not only because it's interesting, because understanding what happened in the past is a big part of the plots. So as I mentioned before, you don't really get a lot of the world outside of the Wilderwood and Valida, but there are mentions of, you know, what's outside. And I think that this is very well done in this book because while, you know, I like epic fantasies, I like huge sprawling worlds where you can get to know all these different cultures and societies, that would have been a detriment to this book. But because there was no map, which I was very sad about, I may or may not have obsessively taken notes and highlighted basically every mention of the other kingdoms and tried to create what I think the map would look like. And I'm going to say, I drew it on a sticky note. It's complete shit. And it's really not good. Let me see if I can get it to focus on this. So as you can see, Valida is right here. To the north is the Wilderwood, and it kind of says that the Wilderwood is about the same size as Florane, which is here. So it can't really be that huge compared to the rest of the continent, so I kind of have it really little up there. And then I know to the north is, I think, open barriers, but it's really cold. And then there's water to the east and the west of the Wilderwood, but it's kind of covered in mist, so it can't really be passed. You have a pass here that's mostly impassable. You have the Alperian Wastes here, Alpera somewhere over there, Medusa to the south, and then they mention, I'm not even going to try to pronounce these, but these two kingdoms are somewhere to the south, and then Rialt is somewhere, I think, across the sea. So that's kind of roughly how I imagine the world looking. So moving on to the history of this world. Okay, so basically, the timeline of the world counts forward from the binding, and before that, magic was just free throughout the world, but there were these monstrous beasts, or I think they call them gods? Yeah, monstrous gods that roamed the world and terrorized them, right? So it was this like bloody, war-filled world where it was very dangerous, and the Wilderwood was open. It was a place where people could come and kind of make bargains with it for like small boons and small little bits of magic like that. And the Wilderwood was supposed to be like a very happy, almost like eternal summer kind of a forest, which is very different to what it is like in the current day. But then at the binding, the 5 kings went to the Wilderwood and bargained to have the monstrous gods imprisoned. So the Wilderwood basically pulled all the magic out of the rest of the world in order to lock all the monstrous gods into the Shadowlands. In year 1 of the binding, or the year of the binding, year 1, if that makes sense, Ciaran and Gaia, which was the first wolf and the second daughter, they weren't that before, but basically they went to the Wilderwood to make a bargain, I guess, for safety, where they wanted to be in there, and they were running from Gaia's father and her betrothed. I'm just making sure I read it the way it is here, which were 2 of the 5 kings. So basically they were running from some of the kings and wanted to be sheltered inside of the Wilderwood. And the legends say that they were basically changed and turned into something new when this happened. So then 50 years after the binding, the kings went back to the Wilderwood, and there's a bit of confusion on exactly why they went. But basically they went back to the Wilderwood trying to bargain again, and they were trapped inside and never returned. So then in year 200, so this is 200 years after the binding, and 150 years after the kings were trapped in the Wilderwood. But what happened was people saw Ciaran bringing Gaia to the edge of the woods, and she was dead. Her body was, basically partially taken over by the woods, if that makes sense. So like vines and roots and everything were all through her body. And Ciaran basically just dropped her at the edge of the forest and said, "Send the next." And that's sort of the initial introduction to that whole, the first daughter is for the throne, the second daughter is for the Wilderwood. So shortly after that, the monsters were unleashed back into the world. So obviously this was horrible. It lasted about 10 years. And then another second daughter, Caldenor of, it doesn't matter, was sent to the woods. So this is the second daughter that was sacrificed to the Wilderwood. And they basically, gave Caldenor back. And then the monsters went back to the Wilderwood. And that is sort of what established this whole idea that if they keep sending the second daughters, the Wilderwood will keep the beast locked inside. And if they don't, the Wilderwood is going to unleash the beasts upon the world, and horrible things are going to happen. And the Wilderwood is still keeping all of their kings trapped, their gods. and which has sort of turned the Wilderwood into a villain instead of their savior. So that was 2010 that Caldonor was sent in, and then 2040, so another 30 years later, was Saitha, another second daughter, was sent. And then 60 years after that, so 300 years after the binding, Mira was sent in as a second daughter. The book starts 400 years after the binding, where Redaris, or Red, is the next second daughter to be sent inside. And I think looking at this history kind of gives you a really good idea of the general beliefs of the people, how they view the Wilderwood, how they view the kings, how they view the second daughters. And when they send the second daughters to the Wilderwood, they're hoping for their gods to be returned. And they're hoping that, like, you know, if our second daughter is pure enough, satisfies the wolf, then maybe they'll finally return the 5 gods. And that's their sort of belief that that's all, I guess, kind of surrounded. And at the very least, sending the second daughters will keep beasts from being unleashed to the world. So, in general, I really like the world building of this book. It is, I don't want to say simple. It's a little bit smaller scale. You're not learning about a ton of different cultures, a ton of different peoples. It's more the Wilderwood itself, this one part of the history. You don't really care about the history of any of the kingdoms beyond that. You don't really learn much of anything about the culture of even the people of Valida, other than this worshipping of the 5 gods and belief in the Wilderwood. Like, you don't really get anything beyond that. I would say that the bits of people and society that you do see is kind of roughly sort of medieval European inspired, trying to create this huge other type of culture, another type of society that's not super obvious to people would take a lot more world building and time, and this really just wants to focus on, you know, this Wilderwood and this story of the binding and the second daughters and the wolf and all that. So while I would normally, I think in another book, maybe be a little bit disappointed by that, we could have a whole conversation about that. But, you know, it's a tool that is used well here. And I think this is a really good example of not over world building, because I really think that anything additional that they would have done would have detracted from the pacing, from the like page turning tension of this story and this like very atmospheric tone that it has, and just not let it be something else, which I think is an important thing to keep in mind for any writer, is just what are you trying to achieve? What actually matters to the book and the plot? And then trying to keep everything else as undistracting as possible. Because, I mean, especially if something isn't integral to the plot, it's not important, your reader is going to be much less likely to remember it. So if you're including extra details that really don't matter, like, oh, there's the second kingdom and this is how this whole culture and society works, but it doesn't actually matter and you could delete it and the book's fine, no one's going to remember that anyway. And anytime you kind of bring it up later, the reader's just going to be confused and be like, what is this? This isn't important. Why would, like, what? What's going on? And that's going to detract from the reading experience. So you really want to be careful and not put more world building than you need. Be aware of what you're trying to accomplish with a book like this, or, you know, any book. And then just not going overboard in general. Like, that's something that I have to think of pretty frequently with my worlds, because I do like it to be larger, and I have, like, I use World Anvil to keep all my world building notes, and I have descriptions and maps of almost every city in my entire, like, empire, and all the different grassland tribes and all this stuff, and, like, how many cities are actually, like, even briefly actually talked about in my first book? Really just one. You have, like, a village, and then you have the capital. That's it. I have every single other one world builded out. I have worked out the characters and relationships of all the other houses and, like, lords and ladies, kings and queens, whatever, throughout the world. A lot of side characters. none of them are mentioned and none of them are important. And I always want to kind of like flex my world building muscles a little bit and be like, look at all this cool stuff that exists in the world that I created. Like, so you know it's here. But like that would just detract and distract and make it, you know, more confusing. And so I have to remember to not throw all that unnecessary stuff in. And reading more focused, world-builded stories like this is kind of a good example of how to accomplish that at a more extreme level. One other thing to kind of mention is that we've talked about the atmospheric aspects of this, but being aware of your tone that you're trying to convey is something that's important to keep in mind when you're world building. Like if you're trying to create a book with a really sunny, happy feel, if you have tons of like gothic architecture and darker worlds and like horrible things that happen and like, you know, just like a darker feeling world, like that's not going to play up with that more sunny feeling. And to contrast, like this book was darker, it was creepy, it was eerie, right? So every bit of world building, almost entirely or exclusively that they touched on in this book matched that tone. It's just something to keep in mind, is that if you're going for a certain tone, you want to make sure that the world around it, the culture, the society is going to reflect that tone. And I think this is a good example of that. But yeah, so that's my kind of world building focused review of For the Wolf by Hannah Whitten. I really enjoyed this. It's a really good page turner. It's very high tension. I read it super fast and I cannot wait for the second book, which is coming out this year. I can't remember exactly when it is, but I think she's already started to send out arcs out. So I think we should be probably getting close, maybe in the next 6 months. But I highly recommend picking it up if you like stories like this. I am also going to be filming another video literally right after I stop filming this one, where I kind of go over the structure analysis, like the plot beats and everything of this book. So if you're interested in that, I will, I guess, probably link that after I post that video because this one will come out first, but yeah. If you like this world building review and want me to do more of them, give this video a like, comment below, let me know if you have any recommendations or, you know, requests, and I'll see you next time.